This is the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and covering topics generated from our listeners.
On this episode, we will discuss corn and soybean crop conditions following the frost, weed control, and other agronomy observations.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
Josh, we've had an interesting spring so far. Last week we talked a lot about frost damage and what we can expect after the cold temperatures we had there, Saturday into Sunday. So now that we've kind of went through it, it's been a couple weeks here. What are your observations, or what did you see the outcomes of the frost?
Well, I think the first major outcome was it tested everybody's patience through the whole process since we last recorded the last podcast. The temperatures got much colder than we probably thought they did just based on weather data. We just had a lot of lethal cold, 24, 5 degrees, in some cases maybe a little bit lower than that in isolated areas. For the most part, things recovered really well. On the corn side of it to start out with, I would say in most cases, a majority of the above ground portion was froze off or killed, with some exceptions in some pockets of southeast Minnesota where they were a little further behind. But all in all, I'd say we recovered pretty well.
Yeah, we had really good weather coming out of it, so it was a little bit cool still the first couple nights. We actually had a couple areas that got nicked a little bit again. I think it was Monday night or Tuesday night, but in general, we finally got some warm weather. We had some good sunshine out there, and the corn really did come out of it. And I think the areas, you go out there and look now, and you can hardly tell that it was frosted already from the road. When you get out there, you can see some dead tissue, but corn has really turned the corner here and is looking good now.
Yeah, and we did some replant corn and soybeans across Minnesota. Brian, in most cases where we did have replant of corn, it seemed like there was another underlying issue that kind of led to the major issue from the frost.
Yeah, so for myself, most of the calls I went on where there was a replant, generated in corn, was usually from something else. And a lot of times it was, working a field wet or, right before that rain we had and there was crusting or something like that. So I think that frost put it over the edge in a couple spots. But the other main thing is, too, when I looked at the frost and any replants that came from the frost by itself, the main issue there was planting depth. So any places where there was a lot of stand loss, usually corn was, an inch and a quarter in, and that was kind of a big issue, and I think that's where we saw most damage.
Yeah, Brian, you and I always preach, seeding depth, that we want to be around 2 inches, and I usually have good reasons like, to ensure good root development, to ensure you're in the moisture, to ensure good seed to soil contact. And now I need to add to that list to protect your corn from a frost, because in most of my cases, any corn replant was a direct result of planting depths shallower than 1 1/4 inches. And those shallow planting depths put that growing point closer to the ground surface. And that cold just penetrated that and really raised havoc. But certainly need to add that to my list of reasons to plant at 2 inches. And I can't say that I've ever said that in the past, but I need to in the future.
Yeah, so in general for corn, not a ton of replants, but like we said, most of them were because of planting depth or some other underlying issue. So, Josh, looking at soybeans, I think there was probably more acres replanted of soybeans from the actual frost itself. What did you see out there?
Yeah, I agree. There was probably more soybeans. In most cases, those early plants, some of our growers wrapped up with corn pretty early this year, around April, 24th or 5th. But some of those early planted beans, most cases where we had a problem, it was on the early plant beans, but specifically around heavy residue, whether it be strip till or no-till. Where we had high residue, this was the same effect on the corn, but where there was more residue, we had more issues with the frost. And that really was directly correlated to those soil temperatures were a little bit cooler from residue. As a result, the cold penetrated those areas a little bit harder. But certainly the blacker the soil, the better it was from a frost standpoint. But from soybeans, it was just directly related to planting date and high residue in some cases. The other thing we noticed that if there were beans that were just cracking through where that crook was exposed, in some cases we froze that crook off, which kind of killed the plant below the cotyledons, which was kind of instant death. But in most cases, just early plant, heavy residue, just kind of a bad luck timing of a cold snap like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So the majority of the beans that I saw that got dinged to the worst were all, just crooking out through the soil. That crook got hit by the frost, and that's enough to kill them. So, the earlier, or it could have been 3 days difference, and there was beans that didn't emerge till 2 days later, and they were totally fine, had a perfect stand. So a lot of it was just poor timing, but in general, I think beans pulled through pretty well. Even some that looked like they got frosted a little bit worse, auxiliary buds and some other things came in and compensated, and they grew through it. So all in all, with as cold of a frost as we had, I think the plants responded extremely well and came out of it. Well, there was some replants here and there, but in general, things turned out pretty well.
Yeah, and just to summarize this was a rare event. Brian, you and I have seen some isolated frost here and there. I personally have only ever, of acres that I've been involved with or monitored, only ever replanted 2.5 acres of corn from frost, where obviously there was a lot more than that. But this was a unique event. It wasn't just an isolated deal. It's something we'll remember for a long time of just how big this frost of an area this encompassed. And certainly I learned a lot. Hopefully we never see it again, but it was a learning experience and certainly a test of everyone's patience, but overall, all good. Brian, just before the frost happened, we were just getting out there to look at corn emergence, and I have to say that as we were looking at final stands and emergence, everything got thrown out the window for about 10 days just because all we were worried about was the corn going to recover from the frost. But we did see some other isolated emergence issues in corn here and there, but what were some of the highlights of that?
Yeah, so in general, it was pretty cold there after a lot of the planting took place, and and issues that come from that, one would be cold shock. So that's where if you ever dig, say you go out in your field and you're seeing some plants missing that didn't come up, and you dig and pull them up and you find the seed, and that's where the mesocotyl kind of spins, or the coleoptile does on its way up. So you get kind of that, corkscrew effect, or you can have them where they leaf out underground. And really that's just from cold stress. Primarily saw that on the coarser soils or the lighter sands, just because that soil can fluctuate in temp more, and that's really what causes that cold shock, is big swings in temperature. In general, though, stand losses from something like that were probably 1 to 3,000 in most fields that I'd see, and the advantage of getting in there and planting early is going to outweigh on yield from what they lost in stand. So that's one thing we've been seeing. Josh, what about things you've seen?
Yeah, I've seen the cold shock as well. Some planting dates seem to be impacted more than others, and no surprise, just based on some of the cold weather we had off and on through the spring. I did run into some starter damage. In some cases, maybe not surprising, because we were extremely dry, for the most part during planting season. Had a few cases where some growers were still dumping in furrow, but dumping on top of the seed, not in front of the seed, in some lighter soils that we had a little bit of issue. Some cases maybe lost 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 plants per acre from that. There was some other isolated starter burn here and there, but that was probably the second most common thing I ran into. And again, not a surprise, just because of how dry we were as we were planting our corn crop. The other thing, when in conjunction to the dry conditions, some growers that did accidentally run a little bit shallow, we saw a little bit of uneven emergence just from not having good placement down there in the moisture. But all in all, the corn crop's kind of been through a lot of challenges this spring, even though it's been a nice spring. But between a few issues of cold shock, a little starter damage, the frost. With all that said, still seeing some very good stands of corn across Minnesota.
Yeah, and I think one other thing that did affect stands that we hadn't mentioned yet was there was some isolated pockets of crusting. We had some rain that bailed that out pretty well. I think it was on a Monday or Tuesday it had rained, but there was areas still that had crusting that caused poor stands, down 5,000-10,000, and did cause for some replants too. So a lot of different things going on this year. Probably more than we'd usually see in a spring, between crusting, cold shock, a little bit of starter damage, and then the big frost. So in general, I think things look really good now. We've had really good weather here through the end of the week. So anytime you can get up into the 80s and have some moisture, that really turns things around.
Yep. And the other secondary effect of the frost, Brian, it really kind of put a damper in some of our weed control programs. Obviously, after that frost hit, we wanted to be really patient before we applied some herbicides back to these crops. And the challenge was the weeds were pretty much unaffected from the frost, so no surprise there. But, so we had some growers that didn't have some herbicides down, and that was kind of their window. And, of course, we had a really nice spring weather, but we couldn't get out there. But we do got some weeds that got really kind of out of hand that we needed to get brought back. And in some cases, we still got some fields that look a little ugly out there.
Yeah, and that was tough, because once that was frosted, really you should wait till you have good new growth, just so the corn plants themselves can metabolize the herbicides we're putting out and not cause more damage than has already happened. So giant ragweed and some of those, especially with the heat, have really taken off here. And another thing, to keep in mind when you're going out to spray is sometimes after a frost, those weeds can be even a little tougher than normal to kill. So I think making sure the tank mixes are right and making sure you have good products out there are going to be important. So Josh, I think dicamba is a product that's going to be used probably quite a bit with some of these weeds as they get taller. What are some suggestions you have around that?
Yeah, I think the biggest watch out, we've seen, the use of dicamba on corn really increase the last couple of years. And the big thing is, a dicamba product with a safener versus a dicamba product without a safener. Really, Brian, those unsafe products, we'd like to spray those kind of early where the corn is pretty young, maybe V2, V3, where it's still pretty flexible. And then as we get above V2 or 4 or 5 inch corn, we really like to use one with a safener as the corn gets more into that rapid growth stage where it can be a little bit brittle, especially down at the base of the plant there. But those are the big things where you just don't want to spray those unsafe and dicambas as the corn gets a little bit bigger.
Yeah, and another call out I'd have is, after the frost, I got the question from a couple people of, does this restart everything for corn? Is it like starting from scratch? And the answer is no, it doesn't. So if that corn was V2 when it frost off and those leaves are gone and dead, it was V2. So that next leaf out and the next collar is going to be V3. So if you're making herbicide applications and, say you're limited to a V3 or a V4 application before you go off label, just remember those collars that we lost if you knew what your field was at before then, or if you can still see the tissue. So, staging is still going to be important, and still, we still got to follow label and to get the safest application possible out there.
Yeah, that's a good call out, and it is deceiving out there. There's a lot of corn that's V2 that looks like it's V2 or V3 right now, when in theory it's V5 plus because of the leaves and collars that we lost. And that's something that we really got to be careful with and watch those herbicide labels, because in most cases you want to watch those V or collar stages before you make those applications. The other thing, Brian, is surfactants. We have a lot of growers locally that we'll be spraying, some glyphosate with acetochlor and maybe tank mix and a broadleaf in there. And those are the tank mixes that we want to be really careful with our surfactant choice.
Yeah, so anytime you start adding things, some of those residual grass herbicides like acetochlor might have a little bit of oil already in the herbicide itself. So if you go out there and, you're making a big tank mix like that, there's a lot of, water conditioning agents now that come preloaded with surfactants. And you got to be a little bit careful if you're going to go out and put a big tank mix out, especially when if it's been hot out and the corn's been growing really quick. It's a good way to burn some corn back, which usually doesn't cause any damage, but anytime we burn it back probably isn't a good thing. So watching those surfactants, if you're putting those mixes out there, really, Dry MS is a great product. And if you are going to use one of the liquid, conditioning agents, make sure it doesn't have too much surfactant load for what you're putting out there.
Yeah, in most cases, we've seen a lot of crop response from these early post products the last couple of years, and in most cases, it's not the herbicide causing it; it's just the added surfactant. But if you are running some of those tank mixes with acetochlor, some atrazine, some glyphosate, some broadleaf, in most cases, all you need is a water conditioner, straight AMS or an acidifier, and the extra surfactants just aren't needed because a lot of times there's enough surfactants and oils in the products themselves. So certainly, avoid that crop damage if you can, because we can avoid it. No need to have it there. So again, Brian, any other call-outs? A lot happened the last 2 weeks, but certainly just off the cuff here stuff, things you want to discuss here quick?
Yeah, just one other call-out with, those herbicide applications. When we talk water conditioning agents, the ammonium sulfates or, those liquid conditioning agents, they need to go in before glyphosate because they're conditioning the water so the ions don't get tied up when you put the glyphosate in. So they need to be in before the glyphosate to make the glyphosate work well.
Absolutely. One of the most common mistakes I see of growers that apply their own is they don't have that mixing order right. And when you don't condition that water first, you can cut your effectiveness of a product like glyphosate down by 25 to 50% if you have really hard water, something that we want to watch real close. So that's a good call out, Brian. So, Brian, I think that's going to be about a wrap, but where can our listeners find our podcast, or people are looking for it? Where's the best place to find it?
Yeah, so there's a couple different ways to get it. One is to talk to your local sales rep, and they can get you signed up for the emails, which come out every time we put one out, if you want to get it directly that way. Otherwise, if you follow us on Twitter, I'm at FarmerBuck1.
And I am at Josh Shofner.
We usually tweet them out, also Pioneer Minnesota will. And then the last way is, these are all posted on YouTube. So all you have to do is go on YouTube, search my name or Josh's name with Pioneer behind it, and they should pop up right below in the query there. So that's where you can find us, and thanks for listening, and Josh, you want to wrap it up?
You bet. So, Brian, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This podcast is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a bi-weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next time.